Welcome to Boatcast, a podcast on a boat where we gently float through stories. Sometimes it is haphazard, there is no beginning, there's no end, just like the river, but it's fun. And this whole project is part of Muziris Heritage Projects. And right now they are having a conference called the International Spice Route Conference, where they have called scholars from across the world, 22 countries, and from India too. And they just, wherever I look, there's just scholars around me, and you know how it feels. I am jokes apart, I am just tapping on each one of them and learning new things. Uh, and with us on this edition is one such scholar. But before that, let me tell you that this whole show is a part of ARI Archives, continues to do interesting work on the Indian Ocean studies and oral histories of Kerala, two editions of a show called Sea a Boiling Vessel. Now back to the guest. The guest today with me is Dr. Akhila Yechury. She's a teacher of history, professor of history at St. Andrews University in Scotland. Uh, and her work, interestingly, has been on the French colonies in India and their effects. And we are going to just, because I don't know anything about it, I just did some basic reading. And we are going to talk to Akila about it. Is it okay if I don't call you doctor?
No, please don't call me doctor. Just call me Akhila.
Akila. So, Akila, welcome to the show. So, as you can see, this show is absolutely informal.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be easy. We'll flow. There's a water.
Well, there's water everywhere.
Yes, that's the spirit. So this show is already doing well. So
Exactly.
so tell me, how come a history of French history? I mean, everybody is doing colonial studies, Dutch. I can understand Portuguese, and and this is thoda hatke. Like, I will swim against the tide kind of choice, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it depends on where you're looking from because, some could argue Portuguese is also thoda hatke. So, it depends on where you're looking from. I think for me, the motivation came from a question, I think, which was asked in one of my MA classes in Delhi University, and about, what are the aspects of Indian history we know nothing about. And reflecting on that, I suddenly thought that I actually don't know anything about the French in India. And that is what, prompted this line of thinking and questioning. But I will say that when it comes to research and graduate studies, the idea is to start from things you know so that you can build blocks. And I went the absolute opposite direction and started with something I didn't know anything about and have worked my way through all of that.
So it's like the maths. One is you go to an answer, or you already have an answer and you have to prove it, right?
Yes. So I did not have the answer.
But good, it's interesting. But the footprint
Mm-hmm.
of the French in India has been absolutely it's at different places.
Yeah.
And also the time.
Mm-hmm.
So let's we will talk about this a little later. But we had East India Company.
Mm-hmm.
The French had a similar company.
Yeah, there was a French East India Company
French
as
East
well.
India
Yes.
Company. So why did the East India Company? I think in the 1760s or something.
So here I will also interject and say something. So my work, I have focused a lot more on the 19th and 20th century.
Okay.
So that's even less studied than the 18th century.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, because a lot of the work that's done on the French is on the French East India Company and the competition with the English East India Company, because they were great rivals in India. And, the rivalry between Dupleix and Clive, subject to lots of stories and, Imperial folklore, if one might call it. But it was a very dynamic competition. And it's also a competition that the French lost, literally in terms of territory, but also in terms of an imperial competition for a territory and for a colony that was to become British India. So it's a loss that has figured quite predominantly in French reflections on empire and imperial pride. And it's a sort of affected how the French have thought about empire. But that obviously wasn't the question you were asking. You were asking about what the French were
No, but that's
doing.
you can just go. No, this is the idea of the show.
Yeah, so, but I am very thin on facts on the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, precisely because a lot of work has been done. And I have, in my work, I argue that the period after this period of competition is equally important for us to try and understand how imperial relations were working in India. Because, so for example, you spoke about the Dutch and you spoke about the Portuguese, but think about the context in which we talk about the Dutch and the Portuguese or even the French. It's all about this competition, the trade, etc. But once all of that competition settles, it's the British we start talking about, right? Predominantly.
Yes.
But the fact of the matter remains that the French stay on, and they stay on till 1956, as do the Portuguese till 1961. Well, so they're there. They're still there, and they're coexisting in this space, which is a British imperial space. And I think it's interesting to see how these very small bits of territory, they're not huge. It's about, together about 203 square miles of territory. I think so. I can't remember my figure precisely.
But around that.
Yeah, around about. So it's not huge. It's so today, for
As they say in Hindi, 19 bees.
Space ka farak, exactly. But they still were a thorn in the side of the British because it was a different political space. But not just different political space in terms of, because within British India, you have different kinds of political space. You have the princely states who are also technically autonomous within their spheres. The British imperial government has a greater influence over the princely states as opposed to the French, whom they cannot influence in the same manner. So it's interesting to see how the two continue to negotiate with each other despite this great power imbalance in India, but a parity in Europe, because France and Britain remain equals at the European stage. So that's some things that I look at.
You see, we have to talk about the past, not only about
Of course.
because the audience here is very different from classroom. Do you know the TIL movement? TIL, do you know?
No.
It is a young. This is a Gen Z term.
I'm not that young.
Yeah. So no, it's a Gen Z term. So that's why we need to go back.
I know, of course.
So today I learned something, that 203 square meters. But you spoke of an interesting character in this whole play, Dupleix.
Yes.
Okay, and because nobody will speak about him, and with French name, I don't know whether it's Dupleix or Dupleix, or whether that house is named.
No, I don't think the house is named after him.
Two stories you
not
get
that
in a condo, or is it Dupleix, or anyways?
Yeah.
So he seems to be an interesting character in history, especially in Indian history, who nobody talks about. Everybody talks about because history is written by the victors. Clive, Clive must have picked a lot from Dupleix's playbook, right?
Well, that is true. Clive does pick a lot from Dupleix's
Tell me
playbook.
more about Dupleix and a little highlights, or unless you don't want to.
Well, the thing is that Dupleix is not my, so I will not be able to pull out stories about him that much.
Needed, but just general.
But I think the thing with Dupleix is that he has great ambition. And he believed in alliances, and he believed, the strategy of working through Indian princely states as opposed to direct conquest in the same. And he had a political strategy from which Clive does borrow a lot. But the thing with Dupleix's history, and a lot of French East India Company, is that it was tied more closely to the crown than was the English East India Company. So that's sort of the established story, is that the English East India Company had greater flexibility, had greater autonomy, and therefore didn't have to constantly refer back to London when making decisions. But the French East India Company was much more sort of hobbled by structures of its governance, which then has an impact on how successful they can be. But then again, there's been a lot of historiography on this. Again, this is not stuff that I focus on, so I will not be able to go beyond that.
Let's talk about Pondicherry and
Yes.
the other five states. So let's start with
Okay.
Pondicherry. Which was the first settlement where, or the biggest was Pondicherry?
Pondicherry is the biggest, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was it the administrative capital?
It was also the administrative capital, yeah. So that, but they had a small bit in the Malabar.
But it's not. It's where they settled, though it has a coast. But Kadlure would have been a coastal town which is closer to it. Why Pondicherry, and what was the reason? Is there any?
So the thing with what's so I suppose part of this story which perhaps needs telling in terms of trying to understand what happens is, so there's of course a period of competition between Dupleix and Clive and between the French and the English East India Company, and the 7 Years' War in Europe, which has repercussions in India, and the Napoleonic Wars, again, which have repercussions.
In India?
Yes, and this is precisely the direct impact of that is the state of the French territories. Because what happens at the end of the Napoleonic Wars is that France and Britain sign a treaty which returns to France all territories it possessed as of 1792. And that date is really important because then all the territories that the French East India Company of France had in India are the ones that remain French. And so that also explains why you have Pondicherry, you have Mahé, you have Chandernagore, you have Yanam, because those were the bits that the French had conclusively in 1792. All other bits were not from. So that also explains why the shape is like that, and also explains why it continues to be like that, because it's written in this treaty, and any attempt to change that involves lots of legal.
Karikal was.
Yeah, Karikal as well. Yes, south of.
So each played a part in a specific trade, or so like.
Well, I don't know if they played a part in a specific trade per se.
Like,
no.
suppose we are talking of this trade route, spice route. Then what? Probably Mahé would have played a part.
Yeah, Mahé, the interest in Mahé came from pepper and cardamom. So that trade is the
definitely a spice.
Yeah, acquisition of Mahé, the attempt to try and develop Mahé into a sort of port town has to do with the pepper trade. And even though, of course, after 1815, the French were confined to Mahé, the trade continues. It's not the same in terms of scale, but the trade continues from there. But Mahé is not a port. And then, of course, with the development of Bombay, all of that trade along the coast, sort of the dynamic of that changes.
Did the French have anything in Madras or Madras presidency? Anything? Because if you look at Karikal was just engulfed by the Madras presidency.
Yes, so is Pondicherry. I mean, they both have the sea, but the rest of it is Madras.
Negotiate politically with the because of these treaties?
Well, the treaty fixed the boundaries, and then there was no negotiation because that's what it was. But the interesting thing about the boundaries is that it was all haphazard. It was not clear, which meant that negotiations did have to happen continuously. One of the interesting facts about the history of French and British relations in India from throughout the 19th and early 20th century is that they keep trying to exchange their territories because the French are frustrated by how spread out their territories are, and the British are frustrated by the fact that these territories create these pockets of, as the British officials would see it, lawlessness within some Madras presidency. So you have cases of smuggling through there, which the British are always concerned about, always worried about. People who, the British think are escaping law, someone embezzled some money and then ran off to Chandernagore, and then, the British felt like that these spaces were used by people to evade law. Then, of course, with the, political sort of mobilization and the national movement, you have more famous people fleeing. So you have Subramanya Bharati, Aurobindo Ghosh, both of whom seek refuge in Pondicherry to avoid the sort of long arms of the British colonial state. So for the British, these spaces were also, they felt they were problematic because they couldn't go in and police those spaces in the way they would like to police them because they were French. And so they wanted to constantly try and consolidate or get rid of the French presence. And the French, I would argue, were not sort of terribly hostile to negotiation. But each moment of negotiation sort of is not conclusive because they can't agree on a whole sort of, sometimes it's very, very petty, like the scale of measurement. And the French used one scale and the British used a different scale, and they would bicker about how much territory it is and therefore not be able to arrive at an agreement for exchange. Or they'd say, you're giving us less valuable land in return for our valuable agricultural land. We don't want to do this exchange. So there were multiple grounds, like small petty grounds on which these negotiations would fall. So ultimately, the shape that was set by the treaty in 1815 is what remains consistent.
So this is like the metric system versus the imperial system, is it?
Oh, it's even even funnier than that, because it's a different. It's not metric versus imperial, but they were both using the biga, but they attributed a different value to the biga.
Oh, is it?
So the way the French calculated it and the way the British calculated was different, and then that meant that when each said, that's 20 bigas, the actual amount of land they were referring to was different. And because they couldn't agree, they couldn't conclude. So,
you won't believe the show I did just before on this seat was Dr. Senthil Babu, who is a historian of mathematics. Okay. And he has done work on the politics of measurement.
Yes,
and interestingly, he studies. He teaches in the French Institute, Pondicherry. So how ironic can this conversation be? So we are on the right track.
Well, we are absolutely are. And I mean, the greater irony is, of course, that I have never spoken to him about the politics of measurement. So maybe that's what I should do.
Yes,
next.
You all can collaborate, because you just spoke about it, and I think it's that bickering is would have started, and today there is another level of bickering.
But I think it also highlights the fact that we take values to be certain, like numbers are certain, measurements are certain. But if you look at the colonial period, measurements are not certain. The values attributed to measurements are not fixed. And there is a lot of sort of variability which comes into all of this, which is worth thinking about, especially when we think about mathematics, because today we think of it as very, clarity. It's a subject which has clarity, but there's so much more going on in there.
So, when we see Bulgari Palace, we just saw, which is a Dutch palace. So, not the main as hall where we were having lunch, but the other places. The main places, of course, vernacular architecture, but the other has big Dutch influence. Other than Pondicherry, I do not see much, or unless you know about it, architectural influence of the French into India, like whether it's Karikal, whether it's Mahé. Is there anything noteworthy where people must see, or they just didn't, they just wanted the vernacular architecture or the local architecture to flourish?
Well, that's an interesting question, because of the various dimensions of what makes architecture and also the politics of, let's say, seeing, what people should go see. Because there's both modern and colonial period representations. In Chandernagore, for example, there are some buildings, there's the main boulevard, and there are French influences that you can see, and there's the cemetery. And you can see the French colonial architecture, sort of forms of French colonial architecture. It's not predominant in the way in which it is in Pondicherry, especially in the Ville Blanche, which is the white town, as it was called in the colonial period. There was a white town and the black town.
Pondicherry.
Yeah, but that bit has been preserved as a historical and heritage sort of through that lens. But what that also creates very often is an imagined idea of what this space was. So the buildings are the same, of course, and many the streets look the same, but people go to consume that as a way of consuming what French India was like. But that's just Pondicherry, and that's one very sanitized space.
And a very small.
Yeah, very small place. Yes.
1 or 2 kilometers. That's it.
Yeah.
Huh?
I mean, that particular bit, yes.
But their administrative buildings were quite grand. It even existed.
Well, in Pondicherry, yes.
Yes.
But in Chandernagore, etc., I mean, they're grand by the scale of what else is around them, but they don't have the grandeur, I suppose, that you would find in other parts of the French Empire in the same
Was
way.
it Chandernagore or was it Chandernagore?
Well, I am half Bengali, so I'm pronouncing it Chandernagore, but names you can,
So, how much, so wherever they went, French are very, when I go to France, I have to speak in French, otherwise they can't even order water. And now at least they have improved a bit, but in the 90s, they were, or earlier than that, it was quite bad. They would just
stare at you.
No, they would put it. There is a French way of doing it. So, how much of French language did they impose on their territories, and is there any history of that? Because we see it across the world. Quebec speaks French. Other the French Creole, Mauritius speaks French. Reunion speaks French. So I want to know about this.
Well, that's definitely a question you should have asked Senthil Babu, because he lives in Pondicherry. But
he was talking about maths and politics. So
yeah, no, but there is
are you trying to duck this question?
No, I'm not trying to duck this question. But the reason I'm saying it's that the people do speak French in Pondicherry, and there is a community of French speaking people, and there are French citizens. So there are Indians who live in Pondicherry who are French, and they also, many of them speak French, but they also speak Tamil. They're multilingual, or majority of them, and all. So it's not today. I wouldn't say it's a dominant language. But then Babu might correct me, and he might have other things to say, having lived in Pondicherry. During the colonial period, of course, having a French language was an advantage, and French was the language of elite communication and administration and schooling. French schools were there, and in fact, the French school still exists in Pondicherry, and there is still a tradition of sending children to the French school, and then perhaps they go for higher education in France. So the cultural links have been maintained, and that was part of a sort of conscious project at the end of French rule, because to create the link was very important in the way it was presented in the negotiation. So when France hands over its settlements to India, I forget Nehru's quote, but it's something about a window to France sort of remains open, or something like that. It's a very famous quote, and it's completely gone out of my head right now.
But it was generally pleasant.
Now, that is a complicated question too, because the idea is that it was pleasant, because there wasn't any conflict, like in the case of the Portuguese, of course, or threat of sending the army. France was and had been open to negotiation from 1947, and they were in conversation with the Indian state. So in terms, and towards the end, it was both states wanted to present it as a mutually agreed upon decision in order to build future diplomatic relations as well. So for both states, it was really important to present it as a friendly transfer of power. But the reality of the period of negotiations and transfer of power was that there was a lot of uncertainty. There was also a lot of movement. There were instances of violence. There were sort of moments of resistance. There was a moment of, people trying to overthrow the French state, but the Indian state arguing that those are not legitimate because they were in negotiations. I suppose one could say that the desire to ensure that it was a diplomatically negotiated agreement meant that a lot of spontaneous responses to colonial rule or rejections of colonial rule did not always find a space in this narrative. So I think the peaceful is therefore a complicated word.
It is always complicated. And this whole idea of treaties have to be sovereign. And that was the part. The territories have to be sovereign, and hence that was put in the treaty, and hence that's why Mahé and Pondicherry all are, though they are geographically apart, they are.
Well, yes. So the part of the agreement was that the cultural integrity of what was French India would be preserved by the government of India. So what you have is the creation of the Union Territory of Pondicherry, which has all its different component parts. So Chandernagore had a referendum in 1948, which again, the referendum is, so it was a unanimous vote
by the people of Chandernagore.
Yeah, the people of Chandernagore, they were asked whether they wanted to, become part of India and merge with India and merge with the contiguous state of West Bengal. And the outcome of that referendum was unanimously in favor of, yes, we want to merge, with I think only 4 no's. But there's a lot of controversy about how that voting took place, whether there was clarity about the question that was being asked. And you have sufficient evidence in the archives to suggest that it was not always clear. So, which is not to say that if there was clarity, the decision may have been different. But what I'm saying is that there's always ambiguity involved, even in decisions which appear to be very clear cut. But what happens with Chandernagore is because it chooses to merge with India and merge with the state of West Bengal, it becomes part of India by 1949. So that sort of goes. And the going of Chandernagore becomes a bit of a template for how the rest of the settlements should be ceded to India and what should happen in terms of the cultural integrity, because there was a feeling that because Chandernagore merged with West Bengal, it lost its Frenchness, and people sort of struggled to preserve that identity. And therefore, the desire to preserve what was French culture was presented by the French as a very strong reason and sort of rationale in their negotiations.
Yeah, but Akhila, can it also be that the national freedom movement in West Bengal was very different from what it would been in Pondicherry and in Mahé, and because we had nationalist leaders coming from Chandernagore. I don't know about Yanam. We'll talk about that when we end. But this could have been possibly a hypothesis.
No, that is definitely important and relevant hypothesis, because Chandernagore was very close to Calcutta. And there is a long history of political refuge in Chandernagore. Aurobindo Ghosh transitions through Chandernagore. One of his close associates, Matilal Rai, is based in Chandernagore. Many revolutionaries, Rashbihari Bose, Khudiram, no, maybe I'm getting that wrong, but Rashbihari Bose, definitely. So all of these people, they transition through Chandernagore during the Chittagong Armory raid. Again, they seek refuge in Chandernagore. So Chandernagore...
They stole the arsenal, right?
Yes, but I mean, I don't think the arsenal ended up, but many of them ended up in Chandernagore. And there's a big raid in 1931, which the French seem to allow, but also simultaneously not approve of. And that's again complicated. But what I'm saying is that there's a continuous flow of Indian nationalists and radicals through Chandernagore. So you're right in saying that there's a greater there could be a greater sense of solidarity and a less of a connect with French Pondicherry or French identity, because also the distance between Pondicherry and Chandernagore is very, very vast, right? So, and they only had they had a mayor. And so these administrative structures and the distance and the closeness to Calcutta could explain some of that. But at the same time, there is a very strong and a long history of French influence in Chandernagore. So the fact that we hear nothing about that dimension in the discussions about the referendum and how it plays out is also interesting in terms of what are the priorities in one place or the other. Though if one was being controversial, one could also potentially argue that there's a sort of strong Bengali identity also, which then could influence that
Why
decision.
controversial? It is a Bengali identity. So, um, the two places which you don't ever hear about. No, we hear about Mahé and we hear about is Yanam and Karikal. Because Karikal has become like I think, is it Chettinad? Is it? But whatever it is, but it and this because they are absolutely not spoken. They're wiped out of memory, and did they play a very small role?
Well, so that's really interesting because, again, if you look at the archives, Pondicherry and Karikal are spoken of almost together as if they were. So, Karikal is almost as important because of its closeness to Pondicherry in terms of official documents, etc. But again, you're right that in terms of memory and in terms of how this is remembered, one doesn't. Karikal doesn't have the same place as Pondicherry, and in fact, Karikal is known more for its temples and study of temples there than the French influence. So there is some of that. But historically and in the archive, Karikal has a sort of more dominant place than, say, Mahé or Yanam because of its proximity to Pondicherry. And Yanam, well, for me, Yanam is really interesting because it's close to my father's hometown. And as a kid, we used to go.
Is it coastal Andhra?
Yes, it is coastal Andhra.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and it always, so as a child, I heard about, oh, that was French, but you didn't see much. But today in Yanam, there is an Eiffel Tower replica, which is a very interesting visit. So anyone who wants to go to Yanam, that's the thing to visit because it's in the middle of a field and you climb up and you can see, at least you could see lots of green about.
It might not be an Eiffel. See, just watch out for that Eiffel Tower. They just might put a wind
tunnel through it.
Wind that
no, it
windmill to it.
No, it is a tourist attraction. As in, it's built as a tourist attraction, but it is not a tourist attraction because nobody goes there.
That and now we are almost at the end of, and you know how long you've spoken?
I have no idea. Have I?
Yeah, and we did well. So Eiffel Tower. Yanam has a Eiffel Tower is very good. Bombay has.
Bombay also has an Eiffel Tower.
17 Eiffel Towers in many.
Delhi also has an Eiffel Tower.
Complexes which the builders sell. पर हमारे पास Eiffel Tower. So it was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you. It was wonderful talking to you as well. Yes.
I enjoyed the conversation, and we must have more politically incorrect thing on French once when you're ready. Let's do it. Let's find a boat. And
we shall.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much. Thank you.